So apparently the Bulls are going to be missing the play-in this season. That's what everyone has been telling me, from the major news outlets, analysts, to non-Bulls fans, to even some Bulls fans here and there. They're projecting the Bulls to finish below 10th in the Eastern Conference this season, which, okay, I get it. The Bulls finished 10th in the East last year, squeaked into the play-in in that final spot. Of course, didn't make it out of the play-in and getting into the playoffs, although they were pretty close in beating the Raptors in the first game and then narrowly taking out the Heat in the final play-in game. And yes, I get it, this team really wasn't good last year, despite being healthy for the majority of the season. And yes, the Bulls, like last season, are not going to have Lonzo Ball, which obviously is a huge factor in their struggles when they're without a high IQ point guard who can also shoot threes at a high rate. So yes, there is little to really give you high expectations for this team or think that they're going to have this great season by any means. But come on now, missing the play-in, finishing 11th or 12th in the East, that's absurd. And I'll explain why in this video. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, you guys know, if you've been following the channel for a while, I don't put out my Eastern Conference predictions video until closer to the preseason, as I like to see how teams are looking coming out of training camp, seeing what the final roster spots look like. I mean, there are still a lot of moving pieces that could potentially happen this offseason. Damian Lillard still hasn't been moved, same with James Harden. There are still a handful of free agents and potential trades that could be made before we get the season kicked off. So I guess that's one problem with pegging the Bulls to miss the play-in already, is it's way too early when rosters haven't been finalized yet. But we'll put that aside for now, and let's talk about how practical that is for the Bulls to finish 11th or below in the East. First of all, let's start with where the Bulls finished last year. 40 wins, 10th in the East. They closed out the season decently when they went 14-9 post All-Star break. Zach finally started looking like himself. The addition of Patrick Beverley running point certainly helped. And when you look at the Bulls season last year, they lost a lot of bad games. Blew games to a lot of bad teams, blew big leads, or ended up digging themselves in such a hole to start the game that even though they were able to dig themselves out of it sometimes and make it a game, it was too little too late, and they would still end up taking the L when, if they had just played hard and stayed focused for the whole game, they might have been able to win. But despite all of that, the Bulls actually played well against some of the best teams in the league, beating the Celtics multiple times, the Sixers, the Bucks, sweeping the Nuggets. They beat the Warriors, which again was kind of the opposite of the prior season in which they beat all of the teams they were supposed to beat, but then couldn't for the life of them beat any of the league's top teams. But looking at last season, the Bulls were the definition of an average team, a mid team, no getting around it. And what were their biggest weaknesses that made them such a mid-team? Well, we already know most of these. Lack of three-point shooting, rim protection, defense around the paint, ball movement and general floor spacing, and limited cutting on possessions, and also just missing a floor general, that playmaker that can guide and run the offense to direct traffic and ensure guys aren't just standing around and watching others work in isolation. So I guess you could say, yeah, it's a lot of weaknesses, and it doesn't help that Zach Lavine was never really 100% until after the All-Star break. But here's the thing that I think a lot of people are overlooking, and this may be me being overly optimistic, riding the hopium on my part. The Bulls last season lost 17 games by 5 points or less. That's a lot of games, and could have been a massive swing in the standings if they had even just turned that around and won half of those 17 games. 8 of those 17 games they lost by 1 possession, meaning 3 points or less. In all of those 17 games, the 3-point disparity in terms of the number of threes the Bulls took in those games compared to their opponent was massive. I'm talking separating by at least 10 threes per game in those games. And you think, hey, if the Bulls can somehow find a way to close the gap in putting up more threes and actually hitting them, they can maybe turn a lot of those close games into wins. It's not as if, oh, if the Bulls could have just hit a few more threes, they'll win so many more games. There are more factors to it than just that. The team needs to establish an identity. They have to come ready to play every night and play with effort on every possession, which they did not do last season. Guys have to be on the same page. They need to sacrifice and realize the common goal at hand and not just wanting to get their turn on offense. Like, they have to be better as a team and working together as a team than to just chalk it up to say, oh, all they need to do is just hit more threes. But as it relates to three-point shooting, because the Bulls know they have to address that going into the season, I know I sound like a broken record when talking about this, but I do, because when I see so many people talking about how the Bulls are going to miss the play-in, they're simply forgetting this point. The Bulls, again, lost 17 games by 5 points or less, 8 by 1 possession. They took the fewest threes in the entire NBA last year, and by a pretty wide margin at that. So what did they do in the offseason? They added 2 players who, I'm not saying that they're elite three-point shooters, but 2 players who have the ability to put up more threes than anyone on the Bulls did last season, not named Zach Lavine. Javon Carter, who shot the ball at over 42% on over 4 threes per game, and a high-level defender and hustle player in the point of attack, which heavily elevates the Bulls in stopping their opponents from penetrating to the basket, as well as just the perimeter defense to prevent their opponent from putting up so many threes, which was a massive issue last season for the Bulls, and so many times letting their opponent light them up from behind the arc. And then I know some will say, oh, Javon Carter, why are we getting so excited about him? Dude averaged 8 points per game last season. That's not the point. What makes Carter an effective addition for the Bulls is, 1, he's a savvy veteran point guard, which the Bulls need. He can help space the floor, which the Bulls absolutely need, and draw defenses away and double teams away from DeMar and Zach, giving them easier looks at the basket than they ever had last season. And then also his defense. And then the other Bulls addition from this offseason, Torrey Craig, fills a need for the Bulls and adding some depth to the 4, another hustle veteran player who knows his role, does his job well, and comes ready to play no matter the circumstance. And a guy who can also shoot threes. I know his overall volume from deep was fairly low, especially by today's NBA standards, taking 3.2 threes per game last season, but hitting it at a 39% clip, and for a Suns team that didn't really need his offense in putting up a ton of shot attempts with the kind of offensive firepower they have. But on the Bulls, a team that is desperately in need of three-point shooters, both Carter and Craig are going to have the green light in putting up shots from deep. And even if their percentages at the rate in which they hit them go slightly down, it's still going to make a huge difference when it comes to winning those close games and in keeping up with other teams who are doing this throughout the league in modern-day NBA three-point shooting. Now, all of this to say, this doesn't mean I think the Bulls are suddenly going to completely turn things around and start looking like they did back at the start of 2021 when they were the #1 seed in the East. It doesn't mean that I think that they're going to be a contending team and competing for a title. It doesn't mean I think that they're going to be a top team in the Eastern Conference. But the improvements that were made on the margins this offseason are going to make the Bulls a better team and certainly at least get them to make a play-in spot at the minimum. First of all, let's take a look at the Eastern Conference. Let's be real. There are going to be a lot of teams that are going to be better than the Bulls. The Bucks, the Celtics, Sixers, Cavs, the Heat, especially if they get Damian Lillard. That's 5 teams right there who I can say with a certainty the Bulls will not finish with a better record than. Of course, there are extreme circumstances that could change that, like a major injury to, say, Giannis or Embiid that could impact their team's overall success, which would afford the Bulls to potentially jump them in the standings. But for the most part, I think it's fair to say that those teams are going to be better than the Bulls. But those are just 5 teams. Now, with the amount of parity we've seen in the NBA, the fact that the margin of error is so slim in the middle of the Eastern Conference, I can't say with a certainty that teams like the Knicks, Hawks, the Nets, teams that finished above the Bulls in the standings last year, that those teams are going to be better than them this year. Yes, a lot of things have to go right for the Bulls to finish ahead of each of these teams. They can't afford to mess around and lose a bunch of bad games. Yes, some bad losses are going to happen here and there, but there was way too many of those last season. Losing to teams like the Hornets, the Rockets, the Spurs, the Magic, that can't happen this year if you're the Bulls, if they want to have a shot at staying ahead of some of these teams. I personally don't think the Knicks are going to be able to replicate what they did last season. I see them falling in the standings just because it's kind of what they do, going up and down year to year, and I see Randall impacting the overall chemistry and success of the team. And as much as I love Tibbs, I do think there is a shelf life with his coaching. The Hawks, I mean, they finished 500 last season, 1 game better than the Bulls. They didn't do much this offseason aside from trading John Collins for parts. They signed old man Wesley Matthews, so who's to say that they're for sure going to be better? The Nets, I actually like their team. I think they're building a nice young core after tearing everything down with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, and I do think Mikal Bridges is going to have a breakout all-star season, but I don't see them making much noise to say that they'll for sure be better than the Chicago Bulls. And then finally, the Raptors, I can't see them being a better team after losing Van Fleet and all the other team chemistry and identity issues they've had, Siakam and trade rumors, same with OG Anunoby, very possible they go into a rebuild. Those were all the teams that finished above the Bulls last season. I have a hard time seeing all of those teams with a certainty finishing above the Bulls this season, especially teams like the Raptors and the Nets. And then, of course, there are those who are saying, well, there are teams below the Bulls who are probably going to be better, particularly the Pacers and the Magic. And while, yes, I agree, those teams will have better seasons. Both teams have bright futures with the young talent they're building and developing, but no, Both of them are still very young, both have a lot of holes in their roster and are still years out from really competing. The Pacers, maybe, just because Haliburton is so good and such a killer in the clutch, and they have a nice supporting cast around him with Mathurin, Miles Turner. They brought in Bruce Brown, who they massively overpaid, but still a good player that's going to be on their roster. They've got Buddy Hield, who is still one of the better three-point shooters in the league. They traded for Obi Toppin, so yeah, if everything goes right for the Pacers, and the Bulls flounder a bit, sure, there is a world in which the Pacers jump the Bulls in the standings. For the Magic, I just don't see how people can say with a straight face that this team is going to finish ahead of the Bulls. Maybe if they had tanked properly and they landed, say, Victor Wembanyama or Scoot Henderson, yeah, sure, they're going to be a better team, and that could be a potential issue for the Bulls. And a team also that has always struggled staying healthy year after year. Was one of the worst offensive teams in the league last season and didn't do much to really bolster their offense. Again, a team with a bright future I think will be competitive in a few years, but for this upcoming season to say they'll be better than the Bulls? No. So I know this was kind of a lot of rambling, but when you look at the Eastern Conference as a whole and stacking the Bulls up against their competition, really looking at the ins and outs of what teams have done over the summer, and to say there will be 10 teams that will finish ahead of the Bulls this season is just foolish in my opinion. But maybe I'm being too optimistic. Let me know what you guys think, where you think the Bulls will finish this season in the standings. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.